what you see here is just a very small sampling of what is available on Covenant Media Foundation. They have thousands of hours worth of lectures, seminars, and so forth from a multitude of people, to include Greg Bahnsen, on a multitude of topics: ethics, philosophy, theology, apologetics, you name it. Check them out at covenantmediafoundationnow.org, cmfnow.org.
Is your God sadistic or is he impotent? Which is it? Okay, now Christian, you choose. Which of those alternatives do you take? Is your God sadistic? He's all-powerful and he's making all these things happen? Or is your God impotent? He really grieves for it like you do, but he just can't do anything about it. Is he without power or is he without goodness? Is he sadistic or impotent? Okay, now at this point, having introduced the problem, and I hope made you serious about it, and at least given you roughly the outlines of its logical difficulty, let's start talking about some of the alternatives that are possible. What are some of the ways in which we might try to resolve this problem of evil as Christians? I'm going to offer 9 or 10 of them to you in rapid succession, and then I'd like to get on to an illustration of the presuppositional method in apologetics, not only as a way of showing that this school of thought's a good one, that's important enough, I suppose, but more importantly to show that we do, in fact, have a good and all-powerful God, one who should be trusted. All right, there are those who say, well, we as Christians look upon this evil that we've seen in the world as ultimately unreal. It appears evil right now, but ultimately it's not real. Not a very adequate solution. In fact, it commits one of the most heinous crimes, according to the Bible, because it really ends up saying that evil is good. Calling evil good and good evil is considered the very essence of sin, in fact, in the Bible. And here we have an apologetical approach, not a popular one in evangelical circles, but it has been used historically to say, well, evil is not metaphysically real. It's not. It's only an illusion. Well, of course, if evil is only an illusion, then it doesn't make any sense to talk about values at all. I mean, because it seems fundamental to any value system that there's a difference between good and evil. But if there is no evil, then there's no difference between good and evil, and there's no sense to talk about values. And so, I mean, we're really throwing the baby out with the bathwater if we take that approach. Well, then somebody else says, well, it's not that evil is not real. It's that evil is really good in disguise. This is very similar to the first option. The first one was evil doesn't really exist. The next option is, well, evil could exist, but all the forms of evil we've talked about are illusions. They really are good in disguise. Now, that's a hard one to follow for most people who aren't philosophically oriented. It's not very interesting. But let me give you a little bit better form of something that's similar to that, and you start to get the point. Somebody says, well, evil is really a means to the good. Evil is, you will, a disguise for the good, in that evil always works out for the good. Evil is always a means to the good. And here's where Romans 8:28 comes in. All things work together for good, right? So even the sufferings of that little child in that outhouse will work together for good. And in that sense, it was only a disguise for good, or if you will, it was only a springboard for God to accomplish His better ends. What's the problem with saying that evil is a means to the good? Well, in the first place, one would want to ask, is God limited to those means? Couldn't He have used other means? Couldn't there have been a good springboard to a good end rather than an evil springboard to a good end? I mean, even if evil works out for the good of God's plan eventually, why was there evil to begin with? By the way, in this context, if evil does contribute to the ultimate good, how can one be sure that good itself doesn't contribute to an ultimate evil? I mean, you see, the unbeliever can reverse the tables on you when you start playing that little game of something is disguised as something else. That looks evil, but it's really good if you just wait around. And somebody says, yeah, well, all those good things you're talking about your God does, they look good, but man, He's going to zap you in the end. So you better watch out when you use these two-edged swords. They cut, both of us. Moreover, if evil is really only a means to the good, then we don't really have an obligation to remove it, do we? I mean, if evil is there to serve the good ends of God, who would we be to thwart the good ends of God? By all means, let the people, rape and pillage and carry on. No, this is not an adequate solution. So let's go to another one. Somebody says, well, evil is really a necessary counterpart to good. Okay? Have you ever looked at a mosaic? Okay? If you get up close to the mosaic and you just look at the individual pieces, then nothing seems to make much sense. It all seems so chaotic and random and all that. But if you back up, all of a sudden things fit into the pattern. What may seem like red out of place in the mosaic, you back up and you see where red set over against the contrast of the blues or the yellows or what have you makes the picture. And so evil is a necessary counterpart to good. Moreover, how would one even know what evil is? How would one know what good is without evil to begin with? Do you know what health is without disease? Do you know what happiness is without sadness? Well, I think this approach to the problem, again, makes God evil by necessity. For you see, if evil is the necessary counterpart to good, and God is good, then that means there must be another supernatural being, necessarily, who is the counterpart to that, an evil one. Moreover, if evil is necessary to good, then God's creative ability has been limited, because it says God can't create a good world without simultaneously creating something evil in the world. And so we don't have an omnipotent God after all. This seems to challenge the all-powerfulness of God. There are those who tell us now to follow another approach, that evil is there to enhance our appreciation of the good. It may not be necessary, but it does enhance our appreciation of the good. Well, the question is, does God appreciate good for all that it is? Well, if evil is necessary to enhance appreciation of the good, then God must experience evil, undergo evil, or be evil, in order for an all-knowing God to perfectly appreciate the good. And that, again, attacks one of the premises. That says that God is not perfectly good. He is good to a certain extent, but then has some evil too. Well, all these approaches that I've been using thus far would probably not be tempting to anybody in this room. I'm assuming so. You would not have been inclined to take that approach to the problem of evil if an unbelieving relative or friend had posed it to you. But they are important historically. They have been raised, and we do need to dismiss them by saying at least as much as we have. Let's go on to a more popular option. This is one that you hear over and over and over in the evangelical world. Evil came from Satan. All right? What's the next question? How did Satan become evil if God is all-powerful? You see, for the approach that says evil came from Satan to be a valid one, you must believe in an ultimate dualism. You must believe, you see, that there is an all-powerful good God and an all-powerful evil God, Satan. And Satan is the source of the evil, God's the source of the good. But that kind of dualism is totally contrary to the biblical portrayal of God. If it were true that Satan is the ultimate source of evil, then God is not omnipotent. And by the way, if there is an ultimate, malevolent deity, that is an ultimate, all-powerful bad demon, then our redemption is certainly in question, isn't it? Who knows whether God will be powerful enough to redeem His people in the end? You see, once you start talking about trying to shift the blame to Satan and forgetting the omnipotence of God, everything gets out of whack in Christian theology. Well, let's try another approach that I've heard in sermons, even in some of the best churches. Evil is permitted as God's warning against sin and as God's punishment for sin. Sin is its own punishment, which is true, by the way, but I'm talking about that premise being used in this context. God warns us by showing us the evil of our sin, what comes from our sin, and God punishes us when we do sin. Well, is that supposed to be God's way of turning men to Himself, to make innocent children suffer in that outhouse? I mean, is the unbeliever supposed to be impressed that God uses such a means to bring men to Himself? It seems to me, a most ineffective way for God to turn men to Himself. There ought to be a benevolent way for God to turn men to himself. But more importantly, if evil is supposed to be the punishment for sin and God's warning against further sin, the distribution of suffering, we must recognize, is not proportioned to man's virtue. And if the distribution of suffering is not proportioned, then is God good after all? It seems like he ought to warn evil men more than he warns good men, or relatively good men. Moreover, why does God punish the wrong men? Why is it the Christian pastors have their houses destroyed in a tidal wave, as well as the prostitutes in town? Why do the good men have to suffer for the evils of others? Why do animals have to suffer, by the way? I mean, are they guilty? Why does God allow animals to be tortured if this is supposed to be a warning to men? So there's something inadequate about that. Well, then there are those who say, you have to have a stiff upper lip. You've got to really believe that, good's going to come of this. God works through evil. God is restraining evil, we are told, and God atones for our evil. Eventually, he will eliminate evil. Therefore, if you just understand the full scope of redemption, if you see that God is working through it, he is restraining it. It could be worse. He's going to atone for evil, has atoned for evil, and he will eliminate evil eventually. But you see, this apologetical approach is saying God's going to clean up the mess someday. But what's the problem? The question is, why did he allow the mess in the first place? Moreover, if we take the approach that says God's going to clean up the mess, that is, he's atoning for evil, will eliminate it, what are we to make of hell? What is accomplished by eternal torment? You see, it's not just that we have men tormenting men on earth in this day and age, but the Bible teaches that God will torment men eternally. He won't torment them for sinning eternally, but the torment will be eternal. And so the unbeliever, again, is not going to be very convinced by this approach. And then finally, there are those who say, and I think this is the most popular approach to the problem of evil, those in the evangelical church would say evil has its origin in the free will of man. C.S. Lewis, by the way, I'm going to be telling you something that I think is true and applicable in another context, but what C.S. Lewis has said is often pressed to service here. Lewis once commented that if God takes human dignity and freedom seriously, then when men decide to plant corn, he will not bring up strawberries. And that's an excellent point. Men must reap what they sow, if you want to use the biblical phraseology. Okay, so God gives man free will. God gives man the ability to follow him, the ability not to follow him in the garden. Man chooses not to follow him. Now, if somebody complains against God at this point, many Christians will say, but don't you see, it's much better to have a world where men have dignity as free creatures and yet have chosen the evil than to make them automatons, to make them robots, to make them so subject to God's direction that they have no individual dignity, they have no freedom. And so the price that we pay for our dignity as human beings is the indignity we bring upon ourselves by sin. That's a very appealing approach. It's one which I think a lot of people hold. I know a lot of people hold, and even many of us may have held it for a long time. I used that approach for many years as a college student. That makes sense. God granted Adam the freedom to go one way or the other, and the price of giving him that freedom was leaving the door open for corn to be planted rather than strawberries. You can't expect, now that corn's been planted, for God to raise up strawberries. And so now we live, because of the freedom of man, which is better than having a world full of automatons, because of the freedom of man, we live in an evil world. I want you to reflect on that for a minute. See if you can come up with the difficulty there. It sounds very orthodox. In fact, for the most part, it is orthodox. God did allow Adam to choose for himself.
Then in what areas is God really free?
Well, I think a person would say here that God was still God when Adam freely fell into sin. Nevertheless, Adam freely did it within the plan of God. And Adam is responsible for that. And let's say this is all orthodox up to this point. Adam is the immediate cause of his sin. God is not the author of evil. Even though God predestined it, God is not the one who forced Adam to evil against his will, drug him into the realm of evil. Adam did it willingly, and therefore Adam's responsible for it. Now, if God wanted men to have the dignity of free agents, and then Adam made the wrong choice, then we have evil. But God is not to be blamed for that. Well, the difficulty is found, I think, very well in the chapter on free will in the Westminster Confession of Faith. This is chapter 9, and I'm going to read for you section 5. Section 5 of the chapter on free will. It's one sentence. It says, "The will of man is made perfectly and immutably free to do good alone in the state of glory only." What is the background to this statement? Well, in the garden, man was free to do good, free to do evil. After the fall, man is not free to do good. With redemption and regeneration, man is now free again to do good or to do evil. But what about heaven? What about the eternal state? In the state of glory only will the will of man be made perfectly and immutably free to do good alone. What the confession is teaching, and I think it's very biblical, what it's teaching is that men are not going to sin in the state of glory. They will immutably and freely choose to do the good throughout all eternity. Notice that man's freedom is consistent with immutable good choices, that he never alters that. He always chooses the good throughout eternity, but he does so freely. Ask yourself this question. When we go to heaven and we're made perfect, does that mean we're going to be made robots? We're going to lose our human freedom? We're going to lose our dignity as human beings? We're not going to have that volition that we have now? No, we're going to have volition. We're going to be like we are now, but we're going to be sinless. But what does that indicate? That indicates that God can be in ultimate control, that we can be free, and we can immutably do the good. That situation is logically possible. In fact, it's the one we're anticipating, where we as free human beings will do the good and only the good throughout all eternity. But if we can have our freedom and immutable goodness, then the question is, why didn't God make it that way from the start? Now do you see the ultimate problem of the free will defense? If man's free will is compatible with him always doing the good, why didn't God give him free will and always make him do the good? Why didn't God, if you will, bring heaven on earth to begin with, if you want to put it that way? So the free will defense is ultimately inadequate also. Well, I hope that at this point you would all be somewhat upset if I said, let's close up the books and go home. Yes, that's right. This is not appropriate, teacher. We don't want to stop now. If you were willing to stop, you obviously are not taking the problem of evil seriously, or you haven't caught on to the fact that all these traditional answers are not good answers. They are not adequate answers. Well, then what are we going to say? Well, I'm suggesting that the presuppositional approach can answer the problem of evil, can show that it is not logically incompatible to have a good God who is all-powerful and an evil world.